Look, good morning and welcome. Thank you to everyone who is joining us today. I can't believe we're in February or almost the end of February already. My name's Richard Keane. I'm in the Analytics and Innovation branch in our Biosecurity Strategy and Reform Division of the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. Before we kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today. For me, in Canberra, this is the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. And I extend that recognition to the traditional custodians of all other lands on which our staff and many participants here today are gathered, and to all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that are attending today's event. Before we start, can I ask everyone just ensure that your microphones are on mute? This webinar is recorded. It should show it up the top there of your screen. To ensure that we stay on time, certainly be an opportunity to ask a lot of questions, but if you can just wait till after the presentation, you can either put your hand up or post a comment question in the chat panel, and we will get across to it as we go along. I think he was just off making a cup of tea or coffee there. I saw Dr. Robertson, but for those not familiar with the Centre for Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis, CEBRA. It's a long-standing biosecurity research initiative of the Australian Government and has been an integral part of the Department's response to managing biosecurity risks since about 2006. Today's very exciting webinar, or CEBRAnar as I'm calling it, will feature the findings from research undertaken by CEBRA on environmental biosecurity risk assessments for conservation areas. It's my pleasure today. You should be able to see there Dr. Terry Walshe, who's a research associate at CEBRA. Thank you, Dr. Walshe. His main area of research deals with the treatment of value judgments and causal judgments in decision making. Particularly interested in developing techniques that better address societal and organisational values, risk and uncertainty, and frailties in expert opinion. His research has included contributions to natural resource management, conservation, public health and biosecurity. The title of today's topic is Environmental Biosecurity Beyond the Matrix. With this, Dr. Walshe is going to explain how risk management for conservation areas is typically based on rough and ready assessments using a risk matrix, combining coarse judgments of likelihood and or consequence. We're then going to talk about the main advantages of using risk-based decision-making tools over the risk matrix approach, including a subset of pests and pathogens that pose a threat to the internationally recognised values of the World Heritage Fraser Island. I'm not going to say that other word there. The department's research lead for this work is Andrew Pearce, who is the Director of Strategy and Support, Environmental Biosecurity Office. As I mentioned previously, he's going to be joining us at the end for the Q&A session after the presentation. Without further much ado, I'm going to now hand over to Dr. Walshe to get us underway, and then afterwards, as I said, we'll have the Q&A. Over to you, Dr. Walshe.
Thanks so much, Rich. First of all, I'll do the clunky thing and share my screen. How are you going? Can you see that now, Rich? And
yep,
everyone?
We can all see that.
All good.
Over to you.
Okay. Usually I get myself lost in the content and are less than gracious. So the first thing I want to do is thank people. Usually comes at the end for most people. So this project stretched out on account of COVID, but there were a lot of people who had an interest in it. A lot of those names on that slide there are associated with Fraser Island, or in the Butchulla language, Gari. So they're stakeholders or co-managers at Gari. And then there's colleagues at the Centre of Excellence in Biosecurity Risk Analysis that helped me out. So thanks to them. And then very much grateful to the good people at DOR, but in particular at the Environmental Biosecurity Office there, who saw fit to support this project. So anything about this body of work that you think is good is my responsibility, and anything that's bad is all these other people. No, that's not right. I've got that the wrong way around. If there's anything here that stinky, it's my responsibility, and anything that's good is the grace and generosity and input of there's very, very many people. So thanks to them. Rich outlined, the blurb, what this presentation is about, and sometimes when you write those blurbs, the content changes substantially. But no, that's right. We're going to look at, we're going to talk about, the motivation for doing this sort of thing, for trying to up our game in the way we characterise risk or conservation properties or reserves or protected areas, whatever you want to call them, and look at the way we don't do it all that often, but the few examples that are around, we commonly use the risk matrix, and I want to explain why I think we should do a little bit more. We should be a little more diligent, a little more perhaps elaborate in our approach. So we've come up with an Excel-based set of tools that come together to give what we hope is effective decision support in sort of two complementary contexts. One is just to characterise what is the magnitude of the risk to these conservation values and to other values under current management. And I guess more importantly, we sort of want to go beyond that, and we want to say, well, what's essentially the business case for intervening? That's we talk about that in terms of decision support, and it's a difficult decision because there are all sorts of interventions that could potentially be on the table. So the tool or the set of tools try to help you navigate those, potentially an overwhelming set of alternatives that you could entertain. So yeah, the structure of the talk, I want to make some prefacing comments around the origins of the project, and I guess sort of saying I think we need to do better. We should do better in conservation is the gist of the prefacing comments. Give you an outline of the main elements of the decision support. Show you under the hood, I guess, a little bit. I mean, all of these things have simplifying assumptions, so I want to just lay bare some of the simplifying assumptions around the way we do the risk assessment that's embedded in the decision support Excel-based tools. And then hopefully we've got 15 minutes or so to have a bit of a discussion. You can ask witty questions and I'll fumble along with some answers. But I think for CEBRA and for the Environmental Biosecurity Office, we're interested in your level of interest in this sort of stuff and whether we should go further. So by all means, ask me about anything central or tangential to what we're going to talk about over the next 30 or 40 minutes. But we are particularly interested in, would you use this sort of thinking? Would you use these sorts of tools? And if so, if you do have an interest, how can we make it more accessible and easier to use? And it might involve training or further case studies, or maybe you're deeply disinterested, and that's okay as well. We're interested in that. Okay, so yeah, these prefacing comments. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was were the origins of the project. Essentially, it was the confluence of two charming people and their motivations. It was Ian Thompson, former Chief Environmental Biosecurity Officer, and Sue Sargent, who is the chair of an organisation, a non-government an NGO, Fraser Island Natural Integrity Alliance, which is a coming together of a bunch of stakeholders and co-managers on this World Heritage area, this World Heritage property, Gari or Fraser Island. And like a lot of bigger conservation properties and World Heritage areas, the management is complex. There are state government agencies involved. There's Queensland National Parks, but there's also the people that look after vacant Crown land. There's local government, and there are a bunch of specific stakeholder conservation groups that have a particular interest in particular areas on the island. And then there are the bachelor people who have, a profound sort of association for many, many tens of thousands of years on the island, and have aspirations, very reasonable aspirations, to be more prominent in its custodianship, over the next 20 years or so. So Sue's very charming, but essentially she petitioned or nagged Ian about, can we do better in thinking about biosecurity on Fraser Island, on Gari. And I say it was a confluence of motivations because Ian Thompson has an interest, or had an interest very much in this sort of area. He expressed to us at CEBRA that you know, his brief basically is to, or was to, make environmental biosecurity, you know, put it up there with other aspects of biosecurity that we care about. So, you know, I've got the little icon of the cow here representing agriculture, and the mortar and pestle, public health, and then the poor old little fairy penguin, the you know, the environment. So very much so, and it remains the case. The environment is the caboose on the train of biosecurity. The main thrust of our investments is directed at agriculture and public health, and there's a little bit around the environment. So Ian and the whole office, of course, is keen to raise the visibility of the importance of environmental biosecurity, but was also had an interest in helping the people who were interested in environmental management and were concerned about biosecurity issues, you know, gaining access to tools that were a little more helpful in them mounting a business case for increased interventions in preventing biosecurity risks. And so Ian and Sue got together and said, okay, well, let's fund a sort of a case study in the development of these tools, and that's how the project came about. I say, yeah, that I guess one of our challenges, one of our issues is a cultural mindset that well, it's not just with biosecurity, but many things. Whenever there is a trade-off, many people who work in environmental management or conservation management, you know, we accept that we are the caboose on the train. Not all people, but I don't think that needs to be the case, or that should be the case. So this, you know, this slide is conservation need not be small fry. It notionally, in terms of society's willingness to pay for better conservation outcomes, is very, very substantial. So the first paper there on the left is pointing out that we spend about 1/6 or 1/7 what's needed to halt Australia's extinction crisis. So that's talking about funding recovery plans under the EPBC Act and state-based acts as well. And I guess, you know, the immediate question would be, well, do we have the stomach do we have the willingness to increase our funding for conservation outcomes by a factor of 6 or 7? And plainly we do. If you ask, you know, if you consulted economists, many studies around willingness to pay for the recovery of threatened species. So the second little paper there is a meta-analysis of a bunch of studies, and it's saying that in US dollars, I mean, it varies a lot, and there's a fair bit of error in these things, but taken as a point estimate, that about $400 per household. A lot of the variation comes from, you know, charismatic or iconic species versus obscure, less glamorous sort of species. But for any individual species, on average, as a point estimate, $400 per household, or $414 per household in 2016. And there are, I think, about 9 million households in Australia. So that's just for one species. So clearly, you know, we could do better. And I guess the question is, how do we ask for more money in a coherent way that makes visible to senior people in organisations like DOR, but also, you know, Treasury and other organisations? How do we make visible the magnitude of the threat and the payoff of various interventions? And that's very much the motivation for this set of tools. I think many of us are aware of this curve. I mean, that the previous slide spoke to, you know, recovery of threatened species, but in biosecurity, most of us are aware that in terms of bang for your buck, in general, you're better off, you know, working down this end of the curve towards prevention rather than asset-based protection. So, yeah, I want to make the general point that in the investment that we do make in biosecurity in our national parks, in our conservation reserves, in our World Heritage areas is perhaps a little bit asked about. We spend, the money that we do spend under the banner of biosecurity would go a lot to established weeds and vertebrate pests. So we spend a fair bit in Victoria on cats and foxes. In other places, they spend a fair bit on pigs and camels, for example. We spend a fair bit on blackberry, others spend a fair bit of money on lantana and so on and so forth. But in general, we would probably be better off, or we should certainly petition for substantial sums of money looking at prevention. So the scope of the work that where we develop these biosecurity decision support tools, risk-based tools, and looking at Gari at Fraser Island, we said, let's just look at, instead of pests and plants that are already there, pest plants and pathogens that are already there, let's look at the pre-border setting, things that haven't actually got into Gari or Fraser Island yet. So when I talk about pre-border, I'm not talking about, I mean, most of us think of that as, oh, that's Australia's borders, or it's my jurisdiction's borders, my state's borders, or whatever. But here we're talking about pre-border in the sense of, or pre-incursion, and we're talking about incursions into a conservation property, a World Heritage area or a national park, or it could be a very, very small conservation reserve. So yeah, in general, we spend a fair bit on established pests. These numbers here represent supposedly, well, they're guesses, they're indicative. But you know, there's a fair bit of support broadly for the order of magnitudes involved here. They're saying that if you spend $1 here, you'll save $1. You'll save $100 in damages avoided. When you're up here, you know, for every $1 you spend, you know, it still might be a benefit cost ratio of around about, it's worthwhile, you know, around 1 to 1 or even 5. The benefits might be 5 times the costs, but you could do a lot better by spending your money here. So I think in general, you know, there's a culture where we're accustomed to being the caboose, that we're perhaps a little timid in asking for more resources, especially at this end of the spectrum. We're very busy, people that work in environmental management and conservation management, with the threats and the challenges that are immediately visible, that are right in front of us, like camels and foxes and cats and lantana and blackberry and so on and so forth. But the other aspect, I guess, is that we don't have ready access to the tools to mount a coherent and strong argument for increased investment. So this body of work can't do anything for changing the mindset that, you know, we're the caboose on the train. We have to do that ourselves, you know, overcome that sort of timidity. And it can't do much to overcome the mindset that, you know, we're fabulously busy and look, I've just got to focus on the deer or the cats or the foxes. But it is hopefully pitched at that third element, or that third barrier around, you know, not having access to the tools to make a coherent and compelling argument for additional resourcing. Okay, I think this is the last slide of my prefacing comments is just around the risk matrix. This particular risk matrix was in a document for a biosecurity strategy for Lord Howe Island, which I think is another World Heritage property. And it's touted as a very good plan. Why is it touted as a very good plan? Well, because it is actually a plan. Most national parks or World Heritage properties, you know, wouldn't even have a considered document that outlines, okay, here are the pre-incursion, the pre-border, the things that are currently outside our property or our national park that we worry about, that could get in, and, you know, here's the risks, and here are some interventions that we could deploy, perhaps to reduce the risk. So it's very, very rarely done. I mean, notable exceptions would be Barrow Island off Western Australia, because, you know, Chevron got heavily involved in gas there. The sub-Antarctic islands, but they fall under different regulatory, you know, processes. The standard sort of stuff where you've got properties administered by state-based or Commonwealth-based conservation or park agencies. Yeah, it's not routinely done at all. Anyhow, Lord Howe Island did it, and they did a serviceable job, and they used this matrix. I do want to say, people sort of say, oh, he's having a go at the poor old risk matrix. In this particular context, I find the risk matrix deficient. So this is a context where we're looking at thinking about trade-offs among different conservation values and costs, most notably with cost. It's not a regulatory decision around, is this acceptable risk or not? So most prominently, people would use the risk matrix, I guess, for import risk assessments. And I think it's a very serviceable tool in that setting. But that is a much simpler, I know it's big stakes, but a much simpler decision-making setting. It's just, is it this side or that side of acceptable risk? Where we're looking at trade-offs between, you know, costs and different conservation values and outcomes for tourism and outcomes for traditional owners, this is not a good tool. But I think, you know, I mean, I say there in dot points, you know, what we typically do is we think about a bunch of pests or pathogens. We rate them according to their risk on this matrix. We identify the ones that fall into the red zone or the orange zone, and we say, gee, what can we do to reduce those risks? And then we write a wish list of interventions. And that's essentially the approach that was adopted in that document, the Lord Howe Island Biosecurity Strategy. So, you know, among the many deficiencies of that approach, you know, I would say that it's not visible what is the aggregate risk to the key conservation values of Lord Howe Island from these multiple pests. They just assess them one at a time. And you know, if I was a Treasury official and they came up and said, look, we want this fully funded, I'd say, well, I have no idea. This is just a wish list of management interventions. I have no idea the aggregate risk posed to the conservation values and the extent to which that aggregate risk is reduced by your wish list of interventions, or your top 10 or your top 20 of your wish list. And they're not even costed, or they weren't costed in any detail in that particular document. So I think we need to do better. So we said, well, how are we going to do better? So moving to the second topic, the second of the 4 topics in the talk outline. This is quite unusual for the University of Melbourne. We said, well, let's deploy common sense. So you know, structured decision making is just common sense. So we clarify the problem in the decision context. We're not looking at blackberry and lantana, you know, established pests and pathogens. We're just looking at what can we do at that front end. You know, more thinking about early on in the biosecurity continuum, prevention and early on in incursions. So it's about pests and pathogens that haven't entered your conservation property. So that's the decision context. The objectives we'll have a look at, but the objectives are around the key conservation values, not all the conservation values, but the key conservation values for any particular property. But they're also about cost. You know, there's obviously a trade-off with cost and what you're going to do to intervene to protect or reduce the risk to these key conservation values. In deploying some of these measures, you will enhance the visitor experience or the tourism experience because you're protecting the things that people are coming to see, which is, you know, the natural values. But you can also diminish through your interventions the visitor experience or the tourism experience. If there are protracted delays to getting on the island or getting into the conservation property because you've got fairly involved quarantine measures, like they do for the subantarctic islands or they do for Barrow Island in Western Australia, people are going to say, well, I don't really want to go if I have to, you know, stand in the queue for 2 hours before or 3 hours before I even get on the island. So one of the objectives is around the visitor experience. And then you could have several objectives. We, in our application, have 2 objectives pertaining to outcomes for traditional owners. So traditional owners and their aspirations very much a part of contemporary management of conservation reserves and other public lands. So we wanted to include those as well. The alternatives around the various interventions, we've got 3 sort of broad banners of the alternatives. We have interventions that could go under the banner of quarantine, interventions that could go under the banner of education and enforcement, and third banner is sort of search and destroy, surveillance and eradication or control efforts. And they're sort of, those banners are hardwired into the decision support tools that we've got. So it's limited, I guess, in what we've countenanced as possible interventions that you can do. Step 4 there, the estimating the consequences, is really the guts of risk assessments. So many of us are familiar with in biosecurity, we go through and say, well, what's the probability of entry and establishment and spread? So that's the likelihood elements. And then the consequences are, well, what would happen if those things happened, if you got entry, establishment and spread? What are the consequences for, in this instance, your key conservation values? But you also need to estimate the consequences for cost. You need to estimate the cost. And you need to estimate the consequences for outcomes for traditional owners, and you need to estimate the consequences for the visitor and the tourism experience. And once you've done all that for a set of alternatives, so some of those alternatives can be very light in terms of the potential set of interventions to manage the risk. Some of them can be very heavy, but you're in a position then to make trade-offs and choose what might be the better set of interventions amongst your alternatives. And I don't want to talk about step 6 today about implementing and monitoring, but it's common sense. Okay, here are the for Fraser Island for Gari. I should point out that the application we did for Fraser Island Gari was very much just a road test, the concepts and the spreadsheets and so on and so forth. The outcomes that I'm going to show you for Fraser Island Gari are not, they're Mickey Mouse. They only looked at the subset of the pests and pathogens that we think are important to think about. So it hasn't been done in full. So they're just sort of for illustrative purposes. Here are 4 key ecological values for Gari Fraser Island. So OUV means outstanding universal value. These are criteria that were invoked in the nomination of the property for World Heritage listing, and they're they were acknowledged as outstanding universal value. So the rainforest there of Fraser Island, the heath, the perch lakes, and the fens are the key natural values, not the geological values, which we decided weren't at immediate risk from biosecurity, pests and pathogens, but they're the key ecological values that we thought should be included. You could potentially have a very, very long list, and lots of conservation managers do have very, very long lists. I used to have a bit to do with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. They have an enormous list of things that they worry about in terms of conservation values. But you create a burden, a huge burden, in terms of risk assessments to estimate the probability of entry, establishment, and spread, and consequences for that enormous list. So we've basically said in the spreadsheets, choose up to 6, no more than 6. And we think that for most conservation properties, there are 2 or 3 outstanding values, and you can accommodate up a few others, but we don't want the full list of 100 because the burden on making all of the judgments about the consequences for various pests and pathogens against those things is plainly too onerous. So we figure get your top 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. We also include here 2 things for the traditional owners, the Butchulla people, and this is very much a reflection of where our relationship was at with the Butchulla people. They were very, very generous, but we don't have a long-standing relationship, and they weren't at a point where they were prepared to talk openly and include in this illustrative analysis various culturally important landscapes or particular species, but potentially you could include those as well. But almost all traditional owners that have an interest in being more visible, more prominent in the management of their country have among their objectives just economic outcomes for their people, but also from a values perspective, even though you might be, the connection to country might come from working on the country, there is the connection to country that is really important in sustaining that culture. We also have impact on the visitor experience. I won't go into these things in detail. Most of my discussion about under the bonnet, the risk assessment, is around the conservation values. And then lastly, we've got the cost of the risk mitigation measures, and you have to cost them with some degree of diligence. I put them in brackets because when I talk about making the trade-offs, there's a part of the decision support protocol and the spreadsheets where different stakeholders, different co-managers will essentially weight these different objectives. And we think that most co-managers, most stakeholders are in a reasonably good position to make trade-offs among most of those, with the notable exception of cost. Most of us are absolutely hopeless at trading off cost with a lot of these other things. So in my game in decision analysis, we talk sometimes about taboo trade-offs. So a taboo trade-off involves a sacred value and a secular value. So for many people in conservation, some of these natural values will be sacred or near sacred. In health settings, human life is also commonly seen as a sacred value. For the traditional owners, a lot of their stuff would be seen as sacred values. Things that you can't really trade off if you're socially competent. People that do, supposedly, people that do immerse themselves in trading off cost with some of these sacred values are seen as socially incompetent in these sorts of exercises. But of course, society needs to do these things. So in our protocol, we said, right, we're not going to ask you to directly trade off cost. We're not going to ask you to demonstrate your social incompetence at these taboo trade-offs. We'll treat it in a roundabout way, and I'll show you how we do it. Okay, so what have we got? They're the objectives. Next, step 3 is the alternatives. And I mentioned that we have these 3 banners. There's quarantine, but there's also education and enforcement, and there's also search and destroy. So what you've got to do if you wanted to use this for your conservation property is you would say, let's just dream up 5 different levels. Level 1 would be current management or status quo, but we would ramp it up, and we would need to describe for each level what ramping it up looks like. And this is what it looked like for our illustrative example for Gari. So it goes from a fairly minimalist effort in quarantine of the current management level 1 at 5 inspection events per year at one of the 2 places where you can get on the island at riverheads, to level 5 heavy, where you've got a pretty formalised and very substantial quarantine effort at the 2, both Inskip Point and riverheads. And obviously it has implications not only for cost, but the imposition on the visitor experience. But it might be fabulously effective at reducing your risks. So anyway, you're not assessing them at this stage. You're just dreaming up 5 different levels. You need to describe them with enough clarity that you can roughly cost them, and you need to do the same for education and enforcement, and also for search and destroy. So the alternatives we essentially have, if you think of status quo, is level 1 for quarantine, level 1 for education and enforcement, and level 1 for search and destroy. That package is one alternative. But because you've got 5 levels under each of these 3 banners, you've got 5 by 5 by 5. In our decision support spreadsheet, you've got essentially 125 alternatives, different combinations of these different levels of these 3 banners of alternatives. And then within each one, you can say, well, they will be implemented by whoever, by a government agency, typically national parks, or it might be other government agencies. Or you could say, in our case, the Bachelor Land and Sea Rangers are going to implement it. And so it's about the extent, or you're interested in, I guess, there are all of these alternatives that would be implemented by government agencies, or all of these alternatives implemented by Land and Sea Rangers. So when you do that, you haven't got 5 by 5 by 5, you've got 125 alternatives. You've in fact got, what have you got, 5 by 2 by 5 by 2, because each one is government agencies or the Bachelor people, and the economic opportunities that comes with that, and the connection to country that comes with that. You've got 1,000 alternatives. So that's huge, 1,000 alternatives. I mean, that's, Lord Howe Island, it was just a wish list of actions. It wasn't different configurations and different combinations of those actions. But once you list, well, in our case, 1,000 alternatives, then you've got to estimate the payoff, the consequences, adverse and positive for the natural values, for the conservation values, for the Bachelor people, for the tourism experience, and for the cost. And it's obviously an overwhelming and enormously onerous exercise. But I mean, I say there, you've got to do the trade-offs. So you've got to do the weighting exercise. But the technical judgments, the probability of entry, establishment, and spread, we do that for not an exhaustive list of potential pests and pathogens. We do it we generate a list of 20. So a little bit like the conservation values, where we just say the top 6 will do. Here we just say the top 20 will do. And you've got to cost them, and then you've got to make judgments about the effectiveness of this. And that is an onerous exercise, but it's not as onerous as saying, what's the payoff individually of all of these combinations? The combinatorial problem is handled by the computer. The computer does it. I'll show you a little bit about some of the simplifying assumptions that we've made in order to, essentially reduce the burden of the magnitude of judgments that you have to make when I talk about the risk assessment. Anyhow, here's the outcome. I wanted to take a little bit of time on this slide. So I think it's important these are the sorts of outputs you get in the Excel spreadsheet. He said that a common feature of the planning context is that managers do not have a strong sense of what budget may be available for biosecurity management. So most of us have no idea. Some of these 1,000 alternatives will be really rather cheap. Some of them will be fabulously expensive. What's a reasonable ask? Don't know. So of course, if you're talking to senior managers or to Treasury, resource availability depends on the imperative for intervention, which is A, the magnitude of the risks under status quo management, B, the prospect for material improvement in risk with action and associated additional resourcing, especially in the conservation setting and especially in these more complex properties where you've got multiple stakeholders or multiple co-managers. Treasury or other organisations that would make the funding decision, they're interested in funding things where there is a broad consensus. They don't want to fund things that might be divisive. So they're interested in the degree of agreement between co-managers and stakeholders. That's point C. And I guess the tools themselves are all about, okay, well, we need to communicate these things clearly. How do we give the bones of an analysis to a group like Sue Sargent's group on Gari, Fraser Island, where they could mount a business case. So what we do, I mentioned, let's avoid the trade-off with cost. The first thing you do in the spreadsheet is you sort of say, ballpark, what sort of funding might be available? And in this case, we sort of said for our illustrative thing, well, over 20 years, we looked at a 20-year time horizon. So the aggregate funding over 20 years, it might be reasonable to ask for $10 million. If we were feeling really brazen, it might be up to $50 million. So that's not each year, that's over 20 years. And what the computer does, once you've made all these judgments and so on and so forth, it says, okay, for each discrete level, it does 11 levels within that interval that you think might be possible to ask for money. Of the 1,000 alternatives, it identifies the best performing one for the value judgments that you've made. So you might be able to see that, it depends a little bit exactly what alternative of the 1,000 you choose for any budget constraint, depends a little bit on your trade-offs. And that might vary from stakeholder to stakeholder. So you can see here for this particular illustrative case study or illustrative example that the best of the 1,000 alternatives at a budget of $10 million is the same as that for 14 million. And then it moves to a different one at 18 million, and it moves to a different one again at 26 million, and then it moves to a different one again at 38 million, and a different one again at 50 million. So just two examples at point A and point B. So what does this mean? This code, this Q1 means quarantine level 1, so status quo. The prime means the bachelor should be implementing the actions. E5 means the highest level for education and enforcement. SD means status quo for search and destroy. So that's the best option for this particular stakeholder with a budget constraint of $10 million. And you just look at it and you say, wow, how brazen are we going to be? You can see that there is a slight improvement. So this is the benefit, the purple bars, as you go up with the budget constraint. But the cost goes up as well. So I don't know. For me, I would be looking at this and I'd say, well, it probably is a bit brazen to petition for this amount or for this alternative because the marginal increases in the benefits are rather modest relative to the very substantial increases in the cost. And you get to unpack it a little bit. So at point A, you know, this is the red bar is the magnitude of the risks under current management, this point here, against your key conservation values. And the green bar is if you were to actually, the judgments, you know, it comes from the judgments, if you were to implement that particular strategy over the next 20 years. This is so the difference in the red bar and the green bar for rainforest is the magnitude of risk reduction you're getting. So that's the point B there, the prospect for material improvement in risk. So you're getting that for the modest investment of $10 million over 20 years, and you're doing slightly better, of course, if you were to spend, well, this one is the costing is about 35 million. But, you know, I don't know, you decide amongst yourselves whether you want to be brazen enough to pitch for that, or whether, you know, the marginal benefit there for the increased price tag is worth it. But that's essentially the outcomes that you get. The other outcome, sorry, this point C, broad agreement amongst key stakeholders. I make the point that this can wobble around depending on the value judgments, the weights assigned by individual stakeholders. You also get this graph, which sort of says, okay, over the different budget settings, the range between 10 and 50 million, the size of these bubbles represents the number of stakeholders and co-managers that supported level 1 for quarantine or versus level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, and so on and so forth. So there were a few, you know, there were a couple of people that had a preference at larger budgets for a greater quarantine effort. And they would have essentially put a lesser weight on the visitor experience. But most people said it's probably not, it comes with too big a cost, both the implementation cost and the imposition on the tourism experience, to really bother with quarantine. For this illustrative example, not necessarily what would happen if we did this in anger for Gary, Fraser Island. Lots of support, no matter what the budget scenario, for education, and increasing support for surveillance and eradication attempts or control attempts as you go to with an increasing budget. So that gives you an indication of the level of consensus. Very quickly, the risk assessment, you know, showing you under the hood. This is, I said, we would limit it to, again, to limit the burden of the magnitude of, or the number of judgments that you have to make. This is the worry list for Gary. The illustrative example includes only those 4 highlighted taxa, the Phytophthora, the Bitu bush. Bitu bush is established on Gary, but we allowed it in the analysis because there's an active eradication attempt that has a very good prospect of succeeding. So they should worry about Bitu bush in the pre-border context again. Cat's claw and mosquito fish. For each of those, you have to do a conceptual model, or we ask you to do a conceptual model to help inform the judgments around entry and to help inform the judgments around the effectiveness of action. So very quickly, I'll just try to make that a bit bigger. What am I doing? Yeah, so tilapia is established just over the waterway, just over over the way at Harvey Bay. So you can get it through unaided dispersal of flood plumes onto Gary. You can get it through release of ornamental fish. You can get it through transport of eggs or adults in fishing equipment, transport of eggs or adults in recreational watercraft. So I think these conceptual models, they're sort of babyish, but they're very, very helpful in looking at the judgments about the probability of entry. So I think this would be a very high probability of entry for tilapia over the next 20 years. Just looking at the picture. You have to assign a number to that. You can't just say it's very high. But also it gives you pause to think about the effectiveness of different management actions. So you would look at these and you would say, okay, people's behaviour and awareness would, you know, probably the good investment here is around education and enforcement. But that investment may not be all that effective because we can still get, you know, we can't really control this one, the flood plumes. So they're just a means by which to aid the very many judgments that you have to make around entry, establishment and spread and the consequences. Very quickly, the scales that we use for the consequences, not especially proud of this work from a academic point of view, but from a pragmatic point of view, I think it's serviceable, but it still has lots of ambiguities in it. So when you go to make the judgments, when experts make the judgments about the consequences of each of these pests, I think there are ambiguities around what do we mean by localized and widespread, and what is an ecosystem changer, and so on and so forth. But from a pragmatic point of view, this was very much, this was derived, this constructed scale, from the translation of Queensland National Parks, from the Statement of Outstanding Universal Values for each of these, these key conservation values. So this is just the one for perched lakes, but we have them also for rainforest and heathland, and so on and so forth. But there's still, before you would make those judgments of consequence, there's still some clarification required around some of the terminology used there. We say that you should get 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 experts together, and you do a formal exercise in the elicitation of expert judgments. So there's a whole other spreadsheet that is dedicated to the capture of these judgments. So obviously you're dealing in settings that are data sparse, but people have strong views about the need for intervening with biosecurity risks, but seemingly they balk at making these judgments. We find that if you do formal exercises in expert elicitation, and it does take a bit more time, involving 5 or 6 experts, they make their judgments anonymously, that you can arrive at, well, I mean, it's empirically shown, you will arrive at better judgments if you just use 1 or 2 assessors that don't use structured exercises in making their judgments. So there's a whole other spreadsheet provided to help you with that. Okay, very quickly, the looking under the bonnet. One of the things we do to reduce the elicitation burden, the number of judgments you have to make, is we don't ask what's the combined impact on rainforest and on perched lakes and so on and so forth for each combination of these pests and pathogens. The computer does it for you, and the way it does it is that it assumes that the impacts of each pest and pathogen are essentially independent, and there will be biological circumstances where that that assumption is naive. So the assumption of independence doesn't say that they're strictly additive. It's a little bit less than additive, and you can have a look at the arithmetic in the spreadsheet or on that slide. Yeah, and as I say, there will be occasional circumstances where, so for example, in wood production areas for pine plantations, if you had deer and they were rubbing on the stems of the pine plantation, you're more likely to get infestation with Cyrex wood wasp, and there would be analogues in conservation as well for that sort of thing. So it doesn't cater for that, but I think those circumstances are fairly rare. The other thing is that we only, when we say what's the effectiveness of the actions, we really only ask, we assume that quarantine reduces the probability of entry, and that education can reduce the probability of entry or spread, and that search and destroy, surveillance and control and eradication just reduces the likelihood of spread. But if, clearly you could say search and destroy does this, but it also reduces the intensity or the magnitude of the consequences. But we just thought, let's keep it simple, because every time we join or we make an arrow to these other things and make it, I guess, richer and more realistic, we also make the elicitation burden, the number of judgments needed, more onerous. Okay, so you can go to that website and you can get the tools. I don't think I've got time to show you the tools. Maybe it'll come up in a couple of questions. The tools are set up so that supposedly you can just grab them off the website and use them. There's a report that goes with it that's also available there that explains in more detail what I've done here. There's instructions on every tab of every spreadsheet to help you along. But it's probably I don't know. I suspect you would need more help if you were to come at this cold. You would need to have someone who knows a bit about Excel, and need to have someone who knows a bit about structured decision making to use it well. So we are interested in your level of interest in this sort of thing. Would you want to use it? And if so, what can we do to make it a little bit more accessible? Thanks, Rich. I'll finish up there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. just got a bit of feedback there. Look, it's very, very interesting there. And from a door perspective, our focus is definitely on pre-border, wherever possible, to treat pests and diseases. And it was interesting to see, I think it was about early on in that presentation, looking at the economic returns, where we focus on prevention and eradication, especially there, just using Fraser Island as a microcosm. But I think that's a true reflection in why we try and do this work wherever possible, especially for goods coming into Australia. So was certainly very interesting there. I won't chew up any more time because I'm sure there's a few questions. So I might just throw it open if you can either put your hand up or chuck a question in the comment line there for Dr. Walshe. And just while we're waiting, in terms of, I guess, helping to better inform pre-border environmental biosecurity planning, what are your thoughts on, where to next for the outcomes from this work? You sort of mentioned, it's readily available for people if they want to access as well, but what are your thoughts there, Dr. Walshe?
Well, I think the first thing we have to establish is their interest, from going beyond, going beyond a minimalist approach or no approach at all. So is there interest in going beyond the risk matrix? And I don't say it lightly, people are very busy, and this is not a trivial undertaking. So do people see the problem as being big enough that they would want to do something a little more involved and a little more sophisticated? And if that's the case, then perhaps we could, in collaboration with the Environmental Biosecurity Office, Andrew and I have talked about it a little bit, but, we could put together training materials, we could put together case studies.
Very good. I could just see here, I think Andy Shepherd, I can only see your hand up, so I'll throw to you, Andy.
Thanks, Richard. Look, good talk, Terry. To be honest, I've been on a bit of a one-man battle around those economic figures that sit under the invasion curve, that they were pretty much dreamt up, and there's a lot of dispute about whether they're really useful. I mean, everybody understands that prevention is better than cure, but actually trying to put economic figures around it doesn't make much. It isn't really helpful when you're dealing with multiple different contexts. So for murder rust, for example, you can't prevent it coming in largely. So pouring lots of money in prevention would be a waste of time. Anyway, that's not my question. It's not really a question. I just wanted to let you know that the New South Wales Local Land Services have been building a system over a number of years of deciding that if something gets in, what should they do about it? Be it a weed, be it a vertebrate pest. And they're now looking at whether or not it'll hold out for pathogens as well. So that would be a very interesting complementary approach to add on the end of your decision support system around what do we actually do to keep stuff out. So I can put you in touch with those guys if you'd be interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yep, sounds very much interesting. Yeah, and I mean, the only thing I would say around the invasion curve, I mean, I only put it in there just to say that in agriculture and public health, I mean, we have, pre-border surveillance, for example, very substantial investments, and very, very substantial investment in our quarantine service for protecting agricultural values and protecting public health. But in conservation, we generally don't do that. All of our investment, or most bulk of our investment, is at the other end. Yeah.
Totally agree with your underlying message. I just dispute, those economic figures are really just a distraction. It's better just to stick with
right.
It. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Andy.
Can see we've got Andrew Pearce also online too. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us, and apologies for not mentioning that before. There's a few questions that are starting to come through here now, and I might just throw to our New Zealand colleagues there. I can see Joanne's put a question there. Says, thank you for the talk, very interesting. What do you see as the advantages in this work that only Indigenous people or areas could have informed you about? Hopefully that makes sense.
That only Indigenous people could have informed us about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think this is early days for engagement of traditional owners or Indigenous peoples. So I think I mentioned that we just had economic outcomes and connection to country. They're important outcomes, but there would be a raft of other things. So I think as management arrangements with traditional owners become more formalised and more substantial, we will need to develop better relationships and for them to feel comfortable enough with including, I mean, we call them objectives, but the raft of values that would be at stake for them when we talk about some of these pests and pathogens. So I think it's early days, and the imperative to have a better conversation will only increase over time.
No worries. And I'm not sure, Andrew, if you want to take this one, but let me know. It's from Jody Chappell. Any thoughts on the potential for funding or interest to be diverted from environment, pests and disease to human health detrimental pests and diseases?
Look, from the perspective of the environmental biosecurity officer, our main focus, of course, is how it relates to the environmental assets. But I mean, that's an increased focus recently with pandemic outbreaks and the consequences of the pests and diseases impacting human health. But we have other work with the One Health surveillance initiative that's looking into those. The relationship of the zoonotic sources for human health. I suppose that's probably relevant to that question, but I'm not sure the system, Terry. How does that fit with adapting it or focusing on the human health?
Yeah, so I think the question was, I think the way it was read was, how about we take money out of the environment and give it to health? But the whole gist of this talk was it could or should perhaps be the other way around, or perhaps we find new money. But the cornerstone of the merit of that argument is developing a clear enough business case that you show, look, these conservation values are important and that they're at risk and that we can do something about it. So that's the whole gist of mounting the argument for perhaps, if there is seen as investments in health or in agriculture, in biosecurity, where we're not getting much of a return for their investment, they could be perhaps better invested in environmental security. You need to go through an exercise, something like this, to make that coherent and make that visible.
I think that's right. And I don't know if it's necessarily diverted. I think it's a blended approach to the way that we put in our funding and apply it across the border there. I can see we've got a hand up here, so I know we've got a few other questions that are coming through there, but this might be the last one noting the time. So Suad, hopefully I've said that correctly. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the right fit. Thanks. It's Terry. Can we apply? Can you see application of your methodology instead of to specific species to pathways, risk pathways, doing the same process and estimating, what trader going through the same process but for pathways? Yeah,
I guess it's possible, Suad. I mean, we did think about that because that would be an efficiency, wouldn't it? But when we look at it, I guess we sort of say it's got to pass a clarity test. When you go to make a judgment about entry, establishment and spread and consequences in particular, it's not really clear what you're talking about when you say, here's a pathway which is floodplains, for example, or it's wind dispersal, or it's, being carried on, wood packaging or whatever it is. So the consequences for the ecological values at stake, I think, in our view, a pathway wasn't sufficient to make the judgments of the consequences. You needed to know what pests and pathogens were involved there. But I think it's worth exploring because it's there are shortcuts that perhaps people need to use because it's, as I say, it's a non-trivial undertaking.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Suad, for that question. I know there's a few others that are feeding through, and we might try and get through those offline, noting the time, and everyone else who is here. But thank you very much to Dr. Walshe, first of all, for presenting. I think it's stimulated a lot more awareness and conversation in this space, and also thank you to Director Pearce as well, who from the Environmental Biosecurity Office, for taking the time to be here and present on this topic. And as we're looking at future agenda items, this one we may unpick a bit further as we go through this calendar year as well, if there is further interest, noting some of these comments that are just feeding through now. But thank you both for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you to everyone that joined in. It was a really good attendance, and thank you to Jason and Chris and the team for helping organise the platform. I was worried it was going to crash, but we stood up to the volume of attendees that came through. So well done there. Thank you, everyone. Speak to you later.
Thanks, Reg. Thanks, Terry.